It's been 3 years since President Obama's inauguration. It's been almost 2 years since Dodd-Frank was enacted into law, and yet the concern on the part of regulators and legislators about too big to fail persists. How do you see that concern playing out in the legislature and among regulators in an election year?
The issue it will be in an election year as to whether there needs to be additional steps taken beyond what Dodd-Frank has provided. Now, one of the challenges is that Dodd-Frank did not limit size. Dodd-Frank relies upon enhanced capital and activity restriction. That's going to create uncertainty for two reasons. One, the rules have not yet been adopted. Secondly, the U.S. has adopted more restrictive responses such as the Volcker rule prohibiting proprietary trading, which has not been adopted in Europe or in Asia. And so the two issues are going to be, are we confident that the capital enhancement plus the activity restriction plus resolution authority that is flexible will basically deal with too big to fail in the context of the 5 largest banks now being 20% larger than they were in 2007.
And it seems that underlying this whole debate has been a tension between a fixed set of rules and desire on the part of regulators to retain flexibility to respond to situations as they arise. How do you see that tension being managed in the next year?
I don't think it will be managed effectively. One of the challenges that Dodd-Frank posed is that so much discretion was given to the regulators with respect to rules, and there's not been consensus as to how one goes about adopting those rules. We still have the regulatory fragmentation. We've got the CFTC and the SEC and the Fed all, for example, having to come up with rules with respect to prohibiting proprietary trading. It's kind of nonsensical to have 3 different agencies weighing in as opposed to one. So given the fragmentation, given the rulemaking that's been assigned, I think we're going to see tension throughout the year. And one of the frustrating things for many of the banks is that the uncertainty makes people cautious about expanding activities or engaging in lending.
And do you think that will extend to potential M&A activity? Obviously, a number of European banks need to raise capital. They have said that many of them intend to do that by selling off non-core assets. Do you think, how do you think the issues you've described will affect the ability of U.S. banks to potentially acquire some of those assets?
That's going to be an interesting question. On the one hand, banks can't make acquisitions if they would wind up having more than a set percentage of assets, of financial assets in the United States. That's the only size limitation in Dodd-Frank. The European banks really have a daunting task. They have to raise $221 billion euros in additional capital. And the question is going to be, will the market basically provide that capital? Probably not. Then there are 2 responses. One is to dramatically shrink the size of those banks or for the government to intervene, and that's really uncertain. And that again comes back to the whole too big to fail issue. When you've got that kind of daunting exercise in terms of raising capital, I don't think any of the European countries are going to want to have any one of their major banks fail. So if the market doesn't provide it, if they can't dispose of their assets, many of which are sovereign debt of European countries, then the only alternative will be to have another bailout to basically make them safe and sound and to meet the Basel III requirements.
And so it sounds like you see at least some bailout as unavoidable almost.
I think it is almost unavoidable. I don't think either the EU or the US has really effectively dealt with too big to fail, because these institutions are large, and with the idea of having enhanced capital as a way of trying to protect against failure, how does one raise that capital? Where does one go? And what happens if the market's not prepared to provide it? And one of the problems for the European banks is many of their assets were sovereign obligations of Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And once those begin to be marked to market, that puts enormous pressure on their capital requirements.